It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, good morning. This was an important moment in American history. Something really fundamental happened as we learned about the election results that came out late on Tuesday. Holy mackerel. I mean, this is a huge election for us as a society.
Well, first of all, for all our viewers who saw our predictions last week, Craig and I are going to meet tonight for a dinner of crow. We missed this one. As I look back on what we said last week, I started by saying that if this were a normal year, the Republicans would win in a landslide because of the fundamentals of the election. But that I didn't think it was a formal year because of the way Trump had acted throughout the campaign, and particularly in the last 2 weeks. Obviously, the voters thought the fundamentals were much more important than his annex. Let me point out just a couple of things about the election. One is this was a much more Republican electorate than 2020. According to the exit polls, there were more Republicans, 35%, than Democrats, 31% who voted, with 34% being independent. In 2020, the numbers were 37 Democrats, so that's a 6-point drop in the Democratic vote. 36 Republicans, so they dropped 1 point. And independents gained 8. They were 26 this time. But what that means is that if Harris got 95% of the Democratic vote and Trump got 95% of the Republican vote, Trump had a pretty substantial advantage because more Republicans voted. The same thing on ideology. It was a much more moderate, interestingly, electorate. The liberal numbers were 23%, which is pretty low. It was a little bit higher, 24 last time. But the moderate numbers went from 38% to 42%. So moderates were the dominant force in the electorate, and even conservatives dropped a little bit from 38 to 34. One other thing. I've talked a long time about the change in the country and the demographic change. And, up until this election, the Democrats have been the ones, and sometimes in ways that have not always been popular, have pushed for multiracial and multi-ethnic coalitions. With Trump's enormous gains among Hispanic voters, he actually put together a multi-ethnic coalition of working-class voters. And the other interesting thing is the racial breakdown in this electorate. We've gone through election after election since Craig and I were active of a decreasing white and an increasing minority population in the electorate. Well, this time, white voters were up 4 points from 2020. They were up to 71%. Black voters were down from 13 to 11%, at least according to the exit polls, and Hispanic voters were down just by a point from 13 to 12. But again, that says something about the turnout efforts, and particularly in the big cities where Kamala Harris wasn't able to get over the top. Just a couple of really quick points. Biden left Harris in a terrible hole. I mean, when you have a president who's got a 40% approval rating, when 3/4 of the country think the country's going in the wrong direction, when inflation, as Craig knows because he beat me on that in 1980, is the critical issue. that's a pretty big hole to dig out of. And in the end, the Democratic effort to turn it on abortion and other things, and freedom and democracy, which I think is pretty important, just didn't work. As a Democrat, this was a pretty, it was across the board defeat. We lost the Senate. We're probably going to lose the House. We probably won't know that for sure for a week or two as they slowly count votes in those tight races, particularly in California and other places. I think Democrats with a Republican Party that has been in such disarray that, as we've talked over the last 2 years in the House, and no governing agenda, and Trump as its leader, and we can't beat it. So it's very clear to me that just as in the 1980s, we're selling a product that voters don't want to buy. And I think we need an effort. I'm not the one to lead it, but like I led in the 1980s and early 90s with Bill Clinton, to redefine the party, sort of a new Democratic Leadership Council effort to develop policies that further the core values of the Democratic Party, but but the policies that can build majority support. Because if you can't do that, you can't win elections. In the end, as we saw again, the fundamentals of American election, the fundamental of an American election is it matters what you stand for.
Craig, how do you take your crow?
I think I'd like it medium rare, please. Al's analysis is one that I have no qualms with at all. I mean, but I want to take a little different perspective. When I suppose I'm a guy who always sees the glass half full. I want to do this a little chronologically, because it's true we didn't bat 1,000. There's no doubt about that. But, a year ago, we said this was not going to end up being a race between Biden and Trump. And we were right about that. I completely agree with Al that Biden's delay in getting out actually, in a way, spared the Democrats from a long primary process. But I think in this case, it probably was a big disadvantage. And even if Kamala Harris would have emerged from that, she would have had more time, on the ground to build her campaign. Mm-hmm. We said a year ago, as we entered this year, that the economy and jobs and inflation were going to be the big issues in this race, and that proved to be more true even than I appreciated in terms of its ability to dwarf the other issues. The other issues, like democracy, like abortion, like crime, just paled in comparison to the economy and to immigration in exit poll after exit poll, and certainly in all of those close states. And that had a big impact. We also said this was in, pretty much the margin of error. The race was very close. But when it comes down to predicting the race, first of all, I ignored one of the a very old tenet, which is it is extremely hard for a sitting vice president to become president. So today, my position remains intact as the only living chief of staff to a sitting vice president who became president. And the reason it's so difficult is that you have several things at play. You have all the downsides of the presidency that you're part of, the administration you're part of. You have a very difficult time when it comes to the loyalty question of separating from the president. George H.W. Bush said to Bob Teeter and me in the 1988 election that he did not want to differentiate from Ronald Reagan until he had the nomination at the convention. Well, for heaven's sakes, that was in the summer of 1988. We finally got him to take a slightly different position, actually, importantly, different position than some in the administration in June. It had to do with Noriega. But imagine that. I mean, and I think it was President Bush who said when he was running that loyalty is not a character flaw. I think Kamala Harris had to be true to herself. I think she remained loyal. She remains loyal to Biden. She knew it was an issue, but when asked the question, what would you do differently, she was really stumped. And the American people wanted something different. They, especially the people who have not enjoyed the benefits of an economic recovery, like many of us, in all honesty. And so the country is divided, but it's divided in many ways in terms of how you're doing economically. That has a lot to do with your education. But you can look at all the polls, exit polls. We can do all the interviews we want to do. At the end of the day, you cannot get away from the fact that it was the economy and to some extent the immigration issue that dwarfed everything else. And where people felt the economy was the most important issue, overwhelmingly they voted for Trump. The issues that a lot of us concern ourselves with about democracy, about style, about how you conduct yourself as a president or a presidential candidate, just don't matter to those people who are hurting economically, and they want to see a change. The interesting thing to me. So anyway, we got the major prediction of the president. We were wrong on, but we were right leading up to it, and we were also right in terms of just how close this was and what the issues hinged on. I will just add a couple other things. We also felt and talked about throughout this year that while former Governor Larry Hogan was probably the ideal Republican candidate in a U.S. Senate race in Maryland, that he had a real uphill climb, having not run in a presidential year before, a real uphill climb. Now, the percentage of victory for Kamala Harris in Maryland was less than it was for Biden, but it was still over 20%, and that was just a barrier that Hogan couldn't break through. So we have historically the first black female senator from the state of Maryland. Some of the races that we're watching here, Dave, on the Eastern Shore on the education front are very close. It looks like it was a pretty challenging year for incumbents in that area, but yet to be determined just how that's going to come out. So all in all, like I said, I think maybe the glass was at least half full. The one final point, and maybe we can talk more about this. I think Trump, however, is left with a real quandary. And I know Al will appreciate this. He's going to, on January 20th, be inaugurated. On January 21st, he's a lame duck because he's not going to run again. But what he's going to have on January 21st is the strongest economy among the industrialized nations. He's going to have a very solid unemployment number to deal with. He's going to have inflation that's been coming down. So I ask you, what is it that he and the people he brings around him are going to do in 2 years when we have midterm elections to convince people that they lowered prices, they've got a stronger economy? So when you start at the high end of things, at a favorable area of things, you leave yourself a big challenge. And if this transition doesn't come together quickly, if he doesn't bring talented people, he just looks for loyalists. It's going to be very hard for them to deliver on the promises he's made to these majority of voters who brought him back to the presidency.
Al, I do want to go back and look at some of this analysis, particularly with women voters. This was supposed to be one of the great strengths of the Harris campaign, was that, for lack of a better word, a silent minority or majority of white women, college-educated women, would rally around a Harris candidacy. That doesn't seem to have happened. And, I guess the question also is, does gender and race still play a role in national politics?
I think the short answer to that last question is yes, gender and race still play a role, but probably not a definitive role like they used to. Look, my guess is in a lot of households, women still do the grocery shopping. And with more women, and women like men have to fill up their gas tanks. The inflation is a pervasive issue. It affects everybody. and it particularly affects people who who have to live paycheck to paycheck. And, for some of us who buy everything on Amazon and have an automatic payment at the end of the month, we may not notice it very much because we're not paying attention. But I was up in Beacon, New York, visiting my grandkids last week, and I went to the CVS and I bought 3 small items. And I was stunned to pay $31 because I don't do that very much. I usually, just click a button on my computer. And it was really revealing. For anybody who's followed my life in politics, I've always been very suspect of identity politics, because I really do believe what I said at the end of this last session, that segment, that what you stand for really matters most. I think maybe some of the steam in the abortion issue had been taken out by time, because people adjust to it. And inflation, high prices, even though the rate's been going down, are facing every day. But the gender gap has 2 elements. One is Democrats winning among women, but the other is Democrats losing men and the Republicans winning among men. And in this case, Trump did much better among men than Harris did among women. So the gender gap worked really against the Democrats. And there are 2 other key points. One is on key voter elements that have been key to Democratic victories. One is that among Latino men, but it was about like a 25 or 30 point swing from Biden to Trump in this election. And Trump actually won Latino men. He also, among young men, Gen Z men, 18 to 29, I believe, came within 2 points of a group of voters that have been going, double digits at least, and probably more in the 20s and 30s in terms of margin for Democrats. So he made real inroads among young men and Latino men. He gained a little bit among black men, but not very much. But the point being is that a gender gap can cut 2 ways. I just want to say one other thing, because Craig went through the long history, and before he started today, I looked back, and in The Spy, for those of you who want to see this, in February of 2022, I had a piece called "Some Advice for My Fellow Democrats." But the main point of this, and this was, I said that Biden had to act on inflation. This was February 22, because I knew what that was going to do and how devastating it was. And I had a very simple point that I think, and that was to pull his Build Back Better. At that point, it was a 3 or 4 or 5, $6 trillion bill. It was enormously expensive bill, and I suggested that he pull that. Pick one priority in it, but pull it explicitly to say that we've got to, we're facing a new round of inflation, and we can't accelerate it with more federal spending. So it's not like some of us didn't warn them, but inflation in the end seemed to bring us down.
Craig, you have the last word this week.
Well, I want to pick up on the point Al was making. There's this fascinating statistic that I found when I look back. When President Biden dropped out of the race, he drove his approval numbers into the 40% range. In November of 1988, at the moment in time when George H.W. Bush was elected president, Ronald Reagan's approval numbers were 57%. And that number, I'd forgotten where it had gotten, that it had gotten that high. We'd come through Iran-Contra, we'd come through these issues, but Reagan was a great resource for us in many states, but overall, the country just felt better about the Reagan-Bush administration. And I don't think that race and gender First of all, I don't think we can actually determine whether it had an impact because these other phenomena, the Biden administration approval rating, the dominance of the economic issue, are so overwhelming. I personally don't think they had all that much to do with the outcome. I also think that Kamala Harris deserves credit for running the race that she wanted to run. And, tearing apart every, decision and every day of the way time was spent is might be helpful to some. But the truth is, these candidates have to be true to themselves. She is a joyful campaigner. She is somebody who avoids some of the specifics, although as she went along in her 107-day campaign, she had a lot more specifics. But it was not enough to overcome this deep concern among so many voters who are just not seeing the recovery the way others are, and that was the dominant force. And you have the phenomenon of a sitting vice president being part of an administration that has not gotten over 50% approval in a country that people think is headed in the wrong direction. Those are very. I challenge any candidate to figure out a path out of, as Al says, that hole. It's a pretty deep hole. I will say this: I think we all owe a huge debt of thanks to those people who volunteer in the whole election process, working in the offices of the state secretaries of state, working in the polling places. We had an election that seemed remarkably trouble-free. And it certainly had probably something to do with the way in which it concluded with the candidate who lost calling the candidate who won and indicating that he'd been elected. But we haven't gone through, even in the process, the kinds of things that people feared, and I think that's healthy for the country and gives us a chance to go forward. This election turned out in a way that a lot of people that we know don't approve of. That was not what they wanted. By the way, it also turned out in the way a whole lot of people we know liked a lot. I'm in some ways surprised by some of the public utterances from friends who were kind of quiet for a while. But the fact is, we have an election process that will fire up again in 2 years with midterm elections. It's going to be, as I said, I think a real challenge for President Trump and his administration to do well in these midterm elections. Traditionally, the party in power loses seats, and so we'll go back through this process. And in some ways, the guardrails are up because if the administration cares about being able to do things with Republican majorities in the Senate, maybe in the House, they've got to figure out a path that reverses the curse of the midterm election where they would typically lose seats. And that, I think, will begin to get them focused a little bit more. I'm not one yet to be convinced that Donald Trump is going to be different than what we've seen. I think there's going to be a good deal of chaos going forward. But, that's what the majority of the American people decided they wanted.
Well, we have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much indeed. We will see you next week.